If I don't seek consensus, people won't follow me. What would you say to that person?
Maybe you're not quite ready to lead just yet. Whether it was a national security decision, whether it was training elements in a 4-ship flight going out to do some combat training, whether it's administering various programs within business, you have to ultimately make a decision. If it is watered down by this search for consensus, it will not solve the problems maybe for anybody.
Welcome to Science of Leadership, the podcast where we explore leadership both practically and scientifically. What makes great leadership, why these things matter, and how we can do them well. Those are the questions we wrestle with through thoughtful discussions and real-world stories. I'm your host, Tom Collins, and today's guest is someone who knows the leadership terrain exceptionally well. General Gene Renuart is a retired United States Air Force 4-star general who was a fighter pilot and served as commander of U.S. Northern Command and NORAD. Over a career spanning nearly 4 decades, General Renuart led at the strategic level, where decisions are complex, information is incomplete, and consequences are real. When I was interviewing General Gene for my study of 4-star officers, he said something that stuck with me. Really jumped out to me. And that was, trying to create consensus on everything is doomed to mediocrity. Today, we're going to tackle that idea, which is one that may often make people uncomfortable, especially in modern organizations. Now, to be clear, this is in no way an argument for arrogance, autocracy, or ignoring people. Instead, it's about understanding the difference between seeking input and demanding consensus, and why confusing the two can quietly undermine excellence. General Renuart, thank you for returning as a guest on the Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be back with you again. This is important work that you're doing, and I think I'm happy to be a part of it.
Well, I can imagine we all carry a definition of consensus in our minds. But for the sake of spelling out our terms, when you said that quote to me, trying to create consensus on everything is doomed to mediocrity, what did consensus mean to you at that moment?
Well, I've been fortunate to be involved in a number of very broad organizations, from early in my career, NATO being an example that is heavily consensus focused, but certainly business organizations, university foundations, all of them have a broad variety of individuals involved in the decision-making process. I've had the privilege to sit in places like the White House and watch decision-making being made at that highest level of our government. And what I've observed over time is it makes people uncomfortable to push a decision to a decision maker if they don't feel fully invested in that recommendation, if you will. And so there's then a sense that we have to ask everybody for their input, and they have to feel good about that result before they're comfortable letting that process go forward. And the challenge with that is that if you pursue that as a matter of course in every issue, you will water down the recommendations to the final decision maker. And you may be that person, but it may be your boss or a boss's boss. You water that down because you're trying to, in my words now, placate an outlying opinion or a very minority opinion that was expressed in whatever the deliberative process would have been. And I think in today's world, it's important that we do include the variety of experience and ideas and inputs that we have. But ultimately, you have to wade through those in a way that gets to executable options, and options that support the goal of whatever this deliberative process might have been, whether it was a national security decision, whether it was something as simple as the training elements in a 4-ship flight going out to do some combat training, administering various programs within business. You have to ultimately make a decision. And the decision, if it is watered down by this search for consensus, it will not solve the problems maybe for anybody. It will leave you with a result that leaders and individuals will look at and say, that didn't solve it. Now what do we do? And so trying to stay away from that kind of process is, I think, important. Not to reduce or minimize the fact that you have individuals in your team or in your room or in your organization who have very different ideas and who sometimes bring up maybe the most important idea and you didn't even expect it from them. So you want a forum that allows for that information to be shared, but ultimately you have to have the process move forward to real executable actions that get to the root cause of why you are in that meeting or in that discussion to begin with.
I've heard this sort of framed as everybody should have a voice, maybe even a vote, but not a veto. And often it seems to me in these scenarios where everyone seems to be so desperately chasing after this ideal that we're all going to come together and we're all going to agree completely on the path forward. And until we do, we're not moving. That seems to be what a lot of people talk about in consensus, when I don't think that's true. And I think that's what you were just kind of alluding to. But this idea almost that essentially anybody can have a veto on the thing. We can, like, 95 out of 96 people can say this is the way that we should go, but one person says no, I don't agree with that, and it blocks everything. I think we see this so much. I try to avoid political discourse here, but within our current Congress, we see one person. There'll be one person who, because they want a bridge or they want funding of this, that, or the other, will withhold their vote on something that's tremendously important. And that effectively is this same kind of idea in my mind. I don't know your thoughts, again, trying to avoid a political sort of discourse, but
Well, I think, I mean, the observation is very real. We have, even in my own experience within the military, we've had confirmation votes held up on an individual, not because a member had a disagreement with the individual, but rather they had a disagreement with the administration's policy on some other issue, and this was their way to get attention brought on that topic. We see within I mentioned NATO earlier, but certainly that's a great example where one vote can derail the process. When you have 32 nations involved in an organization like NATO, that can be very disruptive to the pathway moving forward for the organization and the collective security of the members of the organization. The same is true in our government. I sat in many meetings with at the kind of deputy secretary level of government, and believe that we have sorted out a problem only to have it go back to the staffs of each of those departments of government, and an individual in there raised an objection that then forced their secretary to step away from the agreement we thought we just reached. And so the process has to start all over again. And I think in some cases we've had leaders in the White House who understand that you have to be able to make decisions, and are willing to do that, but their staffs at 2 or 3 levels down don't want to pose a decision because they know one will be made and it may not be the one they like. And so you get caught in this morass of eternally rewriting policy papers so that the wording gets watered down so far that you really have no action at all. And that's really where I made the comment about this almost pursuit of mediocrity. If you're completely average, then everybody's happy and nobody gets anything done. I believe that we as leaders don't want to be completely average. We as a nation can't afford to be average, and so we have to teach our leaders to understand that gaining the differing views is valuable and critical and important. But there's a good idea cutoff phase where you have to say, I think we've explored this as far as we can. Here are the pluses. Here are the minuses. It's my role to make a decision, and so this is my judgment, and to be able to instill confidence in the rest of the team that that's okay. It didn't quite get my opinion in it the way I'd hoped, but we have a pathway forward that gets us to the objective we're trying to reach, and that's a challenge for the leader to instill that in the group at the beginning of the process, not to wait to the end and say, by golly, this is my decision, tough it out. And I think that's an art form in leadership and decision making that we have to instill in our young leaders as they're coming up in their careers.
let me pause here for a second and remind our listeners that my book, The 4 Stars of Leadership, is now available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and essentially all online outlets. It's getting rave reviews, and I'm certain you will find it not only informative, but also inspiring. So I hope you'll order your copy today. Now let's get back to this interesting conversation. As I'm thinking about this, it's mathematical in my mind. It's regression to the mean. So you made the point well that it's critical for us as leaders to seek out inputs, because the reality is we're not expert in everything, and we don't always within ourselves know the best answer, but somebody may. I mean, it's a bell-shaped curve.
Yeah.
Right. And so somebody's going to be on the far right end of the curve and have these great ideas, and somebody's going to be on the far left end curve and have terrible ideas that they have the opportunity to voice, but then we are under no compulsion to follow the terrible idea. But what happens is if we average all those ideas, which consensus kind of brings to the average, we are, in fact, moving away from the best idea that we may have identified, the best strategy to move forward, to the mean. And so that mathematically, this gets to your point about mediocrity, because mediocrity is just essentially the mean.
Yeah.
And so we are, in fact, mathematically, when we do that, when we require everybody to be in agreement, we will have moved to the mean. And so essentially, by definition, that's what is happening.
Well, there are times and certainly there are issues where being at the mean is probably a good solution. And so being smart enough to understand when those times occur. But I would argue that those are the minority of situations, not the majority. And so you have to have the mindset that is, we're going to solve this problem, whatever it may be, and we're going to come up with the best possible approach to that. Best possible, not the best only. And because every great idea out on the far end of that curve also has a bunch of risk with it. And you may not be able to accept the political, the institutional, the economic, the strategic, the military risk of getting to that perfect solution. And so you have to bring that expectation back to the achievable as well, and understanding what the cost of that is. You may have a perfect solution to a problem that will cost you 8 times what you're able to pay or willing to pay. And so there's judgment in there, there's moderation in there, there's deliberation in there. The objective must be to find the best possible solution for the problem you've been given.
I think when leaders hear this word consensus, it has a lure to it. It sounds virtuous, inclusive, respective, collaborative, all these sorts of things. And it can be, certainly, but what do you think makes it sound so appealing to folks?
Well, I think human nature is such that we would prefer not to rock the boat, if you will. We would prefer not to create disruption in an organization. We would prefer not to be highlighted as eliminating an individual or an idea, and that we feel like we want to be seen as sort of wrapping our arms around all of the organization and activity and making them feel included and respected and the like. And certainly that's important to do. We want leaders who understand that you have to make the individuals in your organization feel respected and heard. The reality is, almost virtually all organizations that I've ever been associated with, you actually have to accomplish something, whatever it may be. And so if that's the case, there will be a point where you have to make a decision that moves the organization towards its purpose. And if you strive to have a word in your statement, whatever that will be, that includes the opinion of every single person in the deliberative process, the statement will not be recognizable to any end state. And so you have to work towards that end state, that goal. And again, as I said earlier, that's not doing that at the end of the process. You have to make sure everybody understands at the beginning of the process that there's an objective here, and that we are trying to find an economic policy or a political policy or you name it. And so we actually have to produce something. And oftentimes it could be we produce the decision that do nothing right now because it's better to wait and see. And that will create its own frustration amongst many in your organization. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always positively charging forward to solve, to take on a dragon that you haven't gotten to yet. It could also mean that you're saying we've weighed this, we've deliberated, we've got good inputs across the board. Our best solution now is to hold tight and not make a decision, get some more information down the road. And again, that's a decisive point because you're choosing not to take an action that you feel if you take it will cause unacceptable risk to whatever the organization is. So striving for consensus doesn't mean that you will always charge forward to slay that dragon. It means that you have to listen, you have to understand, and that's what good leadership is all about, and then make a judgment. I was fortunate to have a number of attorneys who worked in organizations that I was in charge of, and we all joke about attorneys, and they are sometimes a challenge for leaders. But my guidance to them is you're not the commander or the CEO or the president. but you're a key advisor. You understand the legal implications of what we're considering. Ultimately, we're going to make a decision. I need for you as my staff attorney to get me almost right to the edge of the cliff. Make sure that I understand what risk I take that will cause me to go over the cliff, and also to understand how far back from the cliff I might want to stay. But I'm the decision maker. I'm the person charged with ultimately making this call. And so I expect your best advice. But I guarantee you, if your advice tells me to go over the cliff, you're going with me. And so it forces us to think about how far do you want to push the envelope, whether it's legally or morally or physically, to achieve success, but also understanding that you may want to back away from the cliff 4 or 5 feet because today isn't the day to take on that additional level of risk. And I think that's an important aspect of leadership that we have to understand. And we have a series of those advisors. They're not just lawyers. They're personnel individuals. They're finance individuals. They're a whole variety of folks who have critical pieces of the puzzle. But their task isn't to lead the organization. That's yours as a leader. And so how you mix their views and their inputs together into the solution set is the art form.
This idea of risk, before our conversation, I was thinking about that and why some people essentially insist on consensus to have everybody's, I think it's wise to have their inputs and all like we've talked about, but those people that insist on having consensus, and it seems like in my mind thinking about it, it's because some people see it as safety. And by that, I mean, consensus spreads ownership, it diffuses responsibility, reduces personal risk of being wrong for the leader, right? If you sort of said, if I'm going over this cliff, you're going with me. It's this sense of diffusing that. And so, if everyone agrees theoretically, then no one is solely accountable. And it got me thinking a little bit about Alfred Sloan. So for those of our listeners who don't know the history of General Motors, Alfred Sloan was this famed CEO of GM back in the, I think, 30s to 50s or so. But there was this one point where he was meeting with his cabinet, if you will, and he said, "Gentlemen, I take it we are all in complete agreement on the decision." And he paused and he said, "Then I propose we give ourselves time to develop disagreement and perhaps gain some understanding what the decision is all about." And so this idea that if everybody's in agreement, people aren't thinking, they're just regurgitating, which is, again, another risk of consensus. But anyway, those are some things I was thinking about leading up to this conversation.
One of the things that's incumbent upon the leader is to be humble enough to understand that you don't have all the good ideas. And a key element of leadership is that humility to understand that you're not the sharpest tool in the toolbox necessarily, and so that you want to be able to seek out and understand the differing views that might surround a question or a problem. And so his point about let's pursue some disagreement is good in that it now enables your team, whoever they are, to speak, with some opposing view. We've all been in rooms where people walk in and the boss walks in and says, "Okay, I need you all to help me decide this. We're going to go down this, this, and this." And they all go, "Okay, we're in, boss. Let's shorten this meeting up. We'll go along with you. Do whatever you want to do." That should be a red flag to a leader as well, because clearly no leader is that smart. If your team, whoever they are, is locked into placating the boss at every turn, probably there's something that you've done to impose your will so much that they're not going to ever disagree. And so being humble enough to understand that you need to seek out differing views is really important and hard for a leader to do. We're all given wonderful elevated positions of responsibility, and sometimes hard to admit that you need to ask for that kind of, I'll say, disagreement. The other piece is this notion of consensus takes away risk for everybody. And again, I go back to the comment about mediocrity. If you're just average, there's no risk to anybody. And so we can all say, not my fault. That silly son of a gun down the road did it, or the boss made it, and I didn't have any input. Nobody asked me, etc. And I think that if you're really growing leaders for tomorrow, you have to then insist that they take risk, that they understand risk, that they calculate the pros and cons of varying risks. And again, they may not in the end sign up for the exact decision that was made, but they understand the risks that were included in that decision, and they can buy into that. Um, and I think um, it's important for all of us to understand that we are held accountable. We have to be held accountable for the decisions we make. I mean, you teach your kids to drive and you send them out in the car, and now they're accountable. You let your child climb on the jungle gym and they fall off. Well, maybe they're not accountable, but maybe you are for not teaching them how to work on the jungle gym. So we're all accountable in so many ways for our activities, and you can't avoid that. Yet this idea sometimes of consensus sort of implies that if we just got consensus, then nobody has to be at risk. We can all be seen as one of the faces in the crowd, and nobody is held accountable to that. And I just don't think that's the way life is.
Sure. Well, thinking about this concept of trying to create consensus on everything is doomed to mediocrity, do you have a story from your career that you could share that kind of demonstrates maybe perhaps where someone insisted on consensus and it led to mediocrity? Or
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, sadly, as you go through life, you have a whole bunch of those stories. It's sort of the nature of humanity. But I think the things that were most striking to me, and I alluded to that a little bit in an earlier part of our conversation, was working on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In my role as the Director of Strategy, Plans, and Policy, I sat on the Deputies and the Principals Committee in the White House and on the National Security Council as an observer there. The chairman obviously sits on that. But that you're involved then in the staffing process to get a decision from a policy coordinating document up through the deputy secretaries to the secretaries, ultimately to the president. It was my observation that the president was if you gave him a decision to make, he would make one. And so the reluctance of the staff to put a decision paper in front of the president might sometimes yield a decision that wasn't their idea, or they didn't sign up as part of the solution. They were an opposition voice in the process. And so it's incumbent upon the principal advisor, in this case, the national security advisor to the president, to understand that you're going to have some of those situations. And sometimes you need to take the decision to the boss, even though it will have opposing views. And it's the president's decision to make it. I mean, a responsibility to make that decision. And I saw many, 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 many times where we would agree at the lower levels. I'll kind of call it the colonel and the brigadier levels of the military, but certainly the civilians in the same regard. We would talk through issues. We would tweak papers. We would try to get consensus on wording and bring that forward to the deputies. These are now deputy secretaries. They may well review that and agree. Those always then go back to the staff with sort of final edits, and back to the colonel levels or the brigadier levels. They would say, "Wait, no, that's not what we meant. We wanted this," and it didn't get written into it. So we're going to go back to our boss and say, "No, object to this because it doesn't have wording X in it." And so as a result, it never gets back to the president for a decision because the varying staffs of maybe 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 different departments of government couldn't agree on wording that was neutral enough that it didn't put their department at risk, and it neutralized some of the pointed words that might have been as part of this decision. And so you start this whole process all over again, and it would go round and round and round. Now, don't get me wrong, that's part of the deliberative process that needs to happen. But at a point, you have to be, in this case, either the national security advisor or the chief of staff of the White House has to say, stop. We need to get this decision to the president. We understand that there's pros and cons. There'll be disadvantages and the like. We will brief the president on that. You, the secretary of your department, can express your concern, but we want a decision paper in front of the president at this next meeting to move forward. And it was amazing how painful that would be. And oftentimes the result was a very neutral statement that didn't really get to the core solution on the issue. To some degree, that's democracy, but it's frustrating when you have to reach, in this case, a national decision that has worldwide implications, and you can't get to the real wording of what the core issue is and a solution. We have to work in that world all the time, and certainly Congress has to work in that world as well. We see budget bills being written and rewritten, and that's how you get 5,000 page national budget, and that ultimately nobody's able to read because they can't get through it. And it has a loophole for many things. And it's unfortunate that occurs. And it is sort of an example of democracy at both its best and its worst. But as much as we can, we have to strive to get away from that and get to clear wording, good decisive effort, and then understanding the risk of moving forward with the best solution possible.
I was thinking, again, I'm veering back toward the mathematical, but I feel like it's the leader's job to weigh perspectives, to weigh inputs, and not to average them, which gets back to kind of what we were discussing. So that's something that is just rolling around in my mind. But as we shift to the so what component of our conversation, why would you say this idea is so important for great leadership?
I don't want to paint this picture that every leader is this sort of George Patton-y kind of person
Sure, yeah.
who, at the drop of a hat will make massive decisions and be very, very direct and forceful, because that's not the style of leadership that I think is most successful. But every leader needs to understand that ultimately their role will be to make decisions that affect their organization. And that can be business, that can be military, that can be diplomatic, it doesn't matter. And if you don't understand that basic principle, then you often can be trapped into um, the move towards consensus as your approach, because you don't want the risk. And again, this we've talked about risk a number of times. Important that young leaders understand risk and risk management and embrace risk. I mean, the world was settled by risk takers. Maybe you're unsettled, I guess the case may be. Who'd have thought Genghis Khan knew what he was getting into when he started marching west from Mongolia, basically all the way to Europe, and the risk that he was taking on and the supply lines he was creating. Now, we might argue with his technique, but the fact that he understood that he had a purpose and accepted the risks of that purpose, and then built along the way decisions. He created the longest postal service in mankind at the time. Why? Because they needed to communicate with home. They had supply chains of logistics that far exceeded what the Romans did as they moved throughout Europe. And there are many examples of that kind of leadership along the way. I think one of my favorite books is A Team of Rivals, that talks about Lincoln during his presidency and his cabinet, who were opponents, not necessarily all close friends, and how he managed the risk of having a team of rivals in his White House, but also understood the risk of a nation divided by civil war and what he had to do and the risk he would have to accept to solve that. Those kinds of things are examples of maybe extreme, but certainly significant examples of how a leader understood the risk that they were handed or forced to assume and how they dealt with them. And those are lessons that young men and women today, and even at the teenage level, you're getting your first car, there's a bunch of risk that goes along with that. I think I made it through 4 days of my driver's license before I had my first accident. So we need to instill in our developing leaders the appreciation for what risk means and how you deal with it, and also an understanding and a certain amount of humility to know that you won't get it right. So when you screw it up, admit it and pack up and go, but not pack up, but go back and begin the process again. I mean, trust me, no successful decision maker made the right decision the first time every time. Sometimes it took 3 or 4 tries before you got to the right decision. But again, having the presence of mind and the humility to understand that, I missed that one. Let's go back and start over again and get it right or better this next time.
Your example of Lincoln is, I think, a perfect example of showing how, I mean, clearly there wasn't consensus. It was getting different perspectives, weighing those perspectives, and then moving forward with a decision that I think it was prescient, perhaps on his part, to have that scenario in his administration, because I would say that was a significant component in maintaining our union in the long term. Had he not done that, had he been in an echo chamber or just a bunch of yes men, that could have been a really different outcome.
Just real quickly,
yes,
importantly in all this is there's a personnel aspect to these as well. We pick successors in our leadership pathway. And so picking the right successors is also critical to moving forward. And if you think about Lincoln's tenure, it took him at least 4, maybe 5 generals of the army before he got to Ulysses Grant, who was arguably an alcoholic and a womanizer but an incredible strategist. Had he not chosen to make those personnel decisions, we probably wouldn't have had the Civil War turn out the way it did. He had consensus generals who grew up within the established environment that people accepted at the time of aristocracy and wealth and the like. And his advisors said those are the people you should pick, and they were consistently wrong in the battlefield. You have to be willing to accept some of that risk in our personnel decisions as we go forward as well.
That's a great point. As we've been talking, it came to my mind that this is, for listeners, this is a Western-centric, I guess, concept. In collectivistic, what are called collectivistic cultures, which are typically, we think, and I've mentioned that on the podcast before, but we think of Asian cultures, China, Japan, Korea, as collectivistic, that everybody's really more for the group as opposed to individual, where in Western cultures such as ours in the United States, it's more individualistic. And so this idea that sort of pushing back on consensus may be a little bit disquieting for those people who come from a more collectivistic standpoint, but it still holds that with regard to decision making and regression to the mean and all that sort of stuff.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because also in many of those cultures, the family unit still has a leader, and in some it's the father. Many it's a maternalistic approach, and the woman is the leader. And so while nationally their culture may be more collective, individual family units are almost always defer to respect the paternal or the maternal leader of the family. And so even in those cultures, there is an understanding that there's a decision maker. And we see that in obviously many of the nations in Africa, where the tribal leader has a big piece of that. So I'd say we probably don't have a good example where there is no leader in an organization. The national culture might vary a little bit, but in the end, we have someone who is responsible.
Jumping into the science on this, what we've been talking about, this idea that consensus, insisting on consensus, creates mediocrity. This actually aligns with what we see in organizational psychology. Groups that strive for unanimity tend to suppress dissent, while high-performing teams encourage dissent before the decision. This gets back to my comment about Alfred Sloan. And then they align afterwards. So studies on group decision-making show that consensus-seeking groups are more vulnerable to groupthink, which I mentioned earlier. They take fewer intellectual risks, which we've touched on, and they converge prematurely on suboptimal solutions. Conversely, if we look at leader-decided, input-rich environments, and that's a key there, where disagreement is encouraged but authority is clear, they produce better strategic outcomes and higher trust over time. So in other words, A, people don't need to agree with the decision to trust the leader. B, they need to believe the process was fair and the leader was competent. So that's some of the things that the science shows us. Any thoughts on those?
Well, I'm sitting thinking of sort of captains of industry out there, and certainly there are many, but one that is current today, obviously, is certainly Elon Musk, who in many ways, I'll just use the SpaceX example, had a vision for where he wanted his organization, his company to go in space, and acknowledged that NASA in this particular case had been the leader in space travel and space exploration and development of safety for space and the like. And Musk said, okay, I understand all they've learned. I don't have to go back and repeat that. I'm going to go forward knowing I'm accepting some risk. And we've seen this with a couple of his test launches that basically blew up in the air. And he and his team said, okay, noted, we got that one. Let's go on back to the drawing board and get ready for the next one. And I think that he to some degree forced high performance on his organization because of his strong personality and vision and acceptance of the risk, and in his case, I think the ability to economically afford to pay for the risk that he was involved in. It emboldened his team to come along with them on that. And yes, there are certainly many people who have left the organization for a variety of reasons, but I've never spoken to anyone who left the organization that wasn't in awe of how they could move the needle in a whole variety of different areas, from space travel to electric cars to aircraft. I mean, a whole variety of things. And his technique, I think we could all maybe have an opinion about in terms of how effective it was individually or on a particular topic. But he clearly has this ability to see what's possible. The truly effective leader is also then able to describe that in a way that brings the team with you.
My takeaway from that is identify those things, those good things you can learn from people. Just sort of set the other stuff off to the side.
You assume that the failures that have occurred. And so, got it. I'm not going to repeat those.
Yeah.
And the good news is, in many ways, in business and in the military, we record a lot of those failures. And so, let's don't go back and start over and repeat them. Let's take a starting point here where we are at success and accelerate forward rather than starting from the beginning.
Okay, General Renuart, we're at that time in the podcast where we turn our attention to making the topic practical. So, how does a leader avoid this consensus trap? What would be your recommendations?
Well, I think first of all, we want to make sure we've created that leader through education over time that understands and acknowledges that there are risks and rewards in leadership, and you have to understand what they may be. And again, no matter what your occupation may be, I think that we want to put leaders in a position as they're growing in responsibility where they have to face risk and have to deal with that, and have to build a team and have to deal with that. And I think we also want to make sure, as very senior leaders, we give very clear guidance on what we expect from our younger leaders, and then give them the flexibility to explore their limitations as leaders, understanding that they will fail at times, and you probably shouldn't reward failure by punishment, but rather the encouragement to go back and try that again and let's see where it takes us, or coach them through a challenging time and situation. And I think in that role as a leader coming up, understanding that you will not always succeed, and be willing to take on a challenge, even though you know that you might not make the right decision. And those are all educational elements that we have to kind of put into our training as we grow leaders. And then again, I think making sure they understand that they are protected, if you will, when they make a mistake. This is not a one mistake world. It can't be. And we want to make sure that we teach young leaders that it's okay. The other piece is we need to teach our teams also that consensus isn't an objective, that best decisions are the objective. And so if you're part of a team, part of your role in that may be the passive leader that says, I made my point, I got it, that's where we're going, now I'll support the decision as it moves forward. And I think we don't spend enough time on that, educating people that you move from being a leader to a teammate interchangeably over and over again. And so you have to understand your role on the team, and there is leadership as a team member for sure. You have to understand that role in the team as well as being the person in charge, and look for, again, best possible solutions, not necessarily the easiest or consensus solution that gets us to okay.
As I was thinking about it, trying to think of practical things, I came to three principles that I think could be helpful. The first is, and you hit on this a bit, is insist on dissent intentionally. And this was something that multiple 4-stars told me. For instance, the late Admiral Snuffy Smith, he was emphatic about it. And he would tell his personnel in no uncertain terms they were to disagree with him if it was appropriate. And if everybody agreed with him, he was not happy about it, and it would toss him out. So this idea that if everyone agrees with you immediately, you haven't asked hard enough questions, you haven't sought a broad enough perspective. So insist on dissent intentionally. The second thing was be explicit about decision rights. This gets a little bit to the thing I talked about earlier, where everybody has a voice plus or minus a vote, but few have a veto. So be explicit about those decisions. People should know whether they're advising the leader, they're recommending an action, or they're making the decision. And I think a big issue that we see is ambiguity on these roles and people's lanes breeds confusion and ultimately resentment if they think that they're supposed to be deciding and really they're just advising or
Yep.
things of that nature. And then the third one is own the decision publicly. So even if it incorporates others' input, the leader must say, this is my decision, and take responsibility, especially when it doesn't turn out the way that we would hope. And I think that last one, is so important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In life we make thousands of decisions every day, and I suspect that some good number of those we look back on and go, "Oops." So Um, but when you translate that into organizational structures, the nature of each of them is a series of decisions that goes forward every day. Hopefully, you don't make every one of them a crisis, but you have to be willing to own the decisions that you make, and I think we're all human enough to that we will not make the perfect decision every time, and we need to be able to go back and regroup when we don't. So that ownership piece is really important. And as I said earlier, the sort of personal humility to understand that you're not going to be right every time, and so you're willing to go back and revisit when it's appropriate.
Well, General Renuart, as we land this thing coming in here to the end of our conversation, I have one question for you. For any young leader who's listening who might have the concern that, if I don't seek consensus, people won't follow me, what would you say to that person?
Maybe you're not quite ready to lead just yet, and I'd say that because you have to take on the responsibility you're given by the organization. That by definition includes a certain amount of leadership role. If you believe that the only way you can succeed is if everybody likes you or everybody agrees with you, then you're not doing yourself or your organization any good. And what you may find is that the other members of your team will respect you less because you're not willing to lead or you're not able to lead. And that's a big risk for a young person. The key to that is to be honest with your team. Hey, I won't have all the answers. We have this task or this job or this mission to accomplish. I don't have all the answers. I need the input from each of you. I value that. But ultimately, I've been asked to be the decision maker, and we'll make that decision and move forward. I think that instills a certain level of confidence, both in yourself, but also within the team that you're going to listen to me, but I know we got to get this thing done, and so we'll move forward.
Thanks for sharing that. So in closing, there's a quote that I wanted to leave with. It's a callback to when I first spoke with you. It was in the 27th of July, 2022 for my interview with you. And I think it ties into what we've been talking about today, but you said you shouldn't be someone just willing to accept average. Let's don't go into this just to tie. Let's go into this to be successful. And so I think this idea that it's important for us to seek out input, but don't demand consensus. General Renuart, thanks again for the opportunity to talk with you, to learn from you, have you on the podcast. As always, been great.
Well, Tom, I enjoyed it, and hopefully there'll be an ear or two that'll get something out of our discussion for sure.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion gave you practical tools and a deeper understanding of what it means to truly know the people you lead and how to build a great environment for success. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share the episode with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.